I was born in Traverse City, grew up there, went to high school, 2 years of junior college, and from there I came to Michigan State and finished in 2 years, and that was in 65, in the middle of the Vietnam War. I knew I didn't want to go to war. I also was pretty sure I wasn't going to pass the draft physical. So I wanted to get that out of the way, and I volunteered for the draft physical and went to Fort Wayne in Detroit, took that. My parents were both born in Vienna, Austria, at the turn of the 20th century. So my father was born, I think, in 1904, and my mother perhaps in 1911. They both grew up in Vienna, which certainly at that time was one of the intellectual and art capitals of the world. My mother had a classical European education. She learned French and Spanish and Italian, and she could speak 5 languages. My father was sort of from the other side of town. His father had a little coffee shop, conditorei kind of a place, and he was born in the back of that. And he was more of a street guy, played soccer and billiards, worked in the banking industry, traveled around Europe, and he and my mother met at my mother's parents' place of business, which was a small coffee shop and recreation place in the Vienna woods. And they played bridge there and taught bridge, and both of my parents played bridge all their lives and were tremendous bridge players. And so they met when they were young. When they met, my mother was still a student. She had matriculated to the University of Vienna and intended to become a physician. Attended lectures taught by Sigmund Freud when she was studying psychology. And then after the Anschluss, which was the word for when Germany annexed Austria and came in and were actually quite welcomed by the Austrians. At that point, my mother's education ended because Jews were kicked out of the universities. So they struggled a bit, to say the least. My mother was a person who was really smart and on top of things, and she could see what was coming and said, "We got to get out of here." And the other people in her group, family, is, "Oh, you're overreacting, it's not that bad." She said, "Yes, it is that bad." And of course, it was that bad. They married in, I think, 37. And in November of 1938, was Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, when the brown shirts were released upon the Jewish population. My father was arrested, standing in line at the British consulate with 2 sets of identification on him, neither of which were his, because he was being paid by people who were too timid to go and stand in line and face the bureaucracy of trying to get a visa to get out of Austria. He was, you always wonder when somebody says how fortunate somebody was in a terribly unfortunate situation. Hard to find fortune by being arrested by the Nazis. But the fortune was that he wasn't immediately taken to the Gestapo. They took him to a regular police precinct place, and a guard took pity on him and let him phone my grandfather, his father-in-law, allowed them to visit and embrace each other, and my father passed these documents off to my grandfather. The next day they shipped him off to Dachau. It's a long, long story. We could spend the entire time talking about that, but my mother was able through a bureaucracy to get him out of the concentration camp. So he spent 4 or 5 months in Dachau. He was released with the idea that he was going to be leaving immediately and never coming back. And part of the documentation to get him out was a fake telegram confirming passage on a non-existent ship from Trieste that would take him, because the deal was if they let you go, it was go away and don't ever come back, kind of a deal. They got out. He got out of the concentration camp in February. He did various things. He was offered to lead a brigade of young Jews to go to Israel, but my mother and my brother, who was an infant at that time, would follow later. My father said there's no way they're not going to all go together. They eventually were able to make arrangements to come to the United States, which was not easy to do. You had to have a certificate of an affidavit of support. A citizen of the United States had to sign that they would be responsible for you until you became a citizen so that you wouldn't become a burden on the state. And through various agencies, they were able to arrange that. They left Vienna in a very dramatic time, and the relief that my mother expressed in her writings of actually crossing the border to get out of Austria and ending up in the Netherlands, I think in Rotterdam, waiting for a ship. And they had to wait a week or two for the ship. And my mother said it's like going from a black and white movie to a Technicolor movie. Things that were not available to anybody in Germany and Vienna during that, because the Depression was considerably worse in Europe than it was in the United States. All of a sudden go to a market where there were piles of oranges and fruits of all kinds and vegetables of all kinds, and actually people with smiles on their faces. And still, at that time, Holland was a free place. They boarded a ship and they left Europe in late August of 1939, and on September 1st, Hitler invaded Poland, and the war actually really started. So it's unlikely they would have gotten out after that, or at least the way they did. Fairly typical immigrant story, arriving in Ellis Island with lots of trepidation. What are we going to do? What's happening? My brother was an infant. He was a year old at that time. They ended up in a tenement in September. It was 100 degrees on the 3rd floor in a little attic room, and nothing was going right in New York for them. My father didn't speak any English. He actually tracked down a distant cousin who said, well, I can get you a job because you speak German. And so my father walked across the entire island of Manhattan to find out that this guy was working at a Nazi Bund restaurant. And of course, my father decided not to take that job. My mother had some relatives in Detroit, so they went to Detroit and were there a short time. And nothing was really going well there for them in terms of a job or so on. And the Jewish community in Traverse City, Michigan, which, by the way, is the oldest continuously used synagogue in the state of Michigan, through the United Jewish Appeal, said they would take on the responsibility of a refugee family. So my parents boarded a North Star bus and rode the bus from Detroit to Traverse City on a cold November day, got off the bus in front of the Whiting Hotel. I didn't know anybody. My father spoke no English. My mother had, 12 years of English. She spoke the King's English, so she might as well have not spoken English either, compared to the dialect that was being spoken by the people in town. And it was a very, very difficult and horrible time. My parents, obviously, we were aware of the situation in Europe and how dire it was. And they were frantic to try to get my mother's parents out and my father's father and brothers out, and failed in all of their efforts because they couldn't raise any money. They couldn't understand how people wouldn't help them financially more than they already had. They didn't want to take on any more responsibility. When they looked all around and the people who had sponsored them had homes and automobiles and refrigerators full of food, and they came from a place in time where nobody had anything. So they were pretty much strangers in a strange land. They didn't have anything in common with the Jewish population of Traverse City, and they didn't have anything in common with the population of Traverse City that also had been there historically, because the Jewish people in Traverse City at that time were pretty much stereotypical Middle European, Eastern European, second, third generation peddlers who were Orthodox people. And my parents were not religious at all. They struggled, but it worked. The American dream worked for us. They came here fleeing for their lives. They were the only ones of their families that made it, with the exception of my mother's sister, who had gotten out a little sooner. My father had various menial jobs while he was trying to learn the language, and worked in a dump for a while. They'd send him off to get a hammer. He'd come back with a wrench. They'd all laugh at him. But he learned English the way a lot of us have seen in the movies. He went to the movies and sat there and watched movies after movies to learn the language. He eventually had a job in a small factory in Traverse City that made clothing called True Fit Trousers, which was owned by a member of the Jewish congregation, which was how he got into that job. But he wasn't particularly comfortable with that job for a number of reasons. And at some point, an opportunity came, and he took the civil service exams, and he went to work for the state of Michigan as an attendant at the state hospital in Traverse City. And at that time, the state of Michigan had at least 4 big mental institutions. One in Traverse City, one in Brighton, one in Ionia, maybe one in Kalamazoo. So my father was hired on as an attendant, got an education equivalent to being a practical nurse. His working there at the hospital is a fascinating story. Most of the people that he worked with were not as educated or as sophisticated as he was. Most of his fellow workers, really looked upon their job as being a guard, which is essentially what they were, because there really wasn't any therapy going on at that time. So my father worked there for a number of years and worked his way and became accepted and then looked up to and a leader at his level. And at some point they came to him and asked him if he would take over and be the supervisor on this particular ward, which was the most violent, craziest ward in the hospital, where a lot of the people in the mental institutions at that time were not mentally ill in the sense of what we think of today, but were alcoholics or had low IQs, and the families didn't want them, and it was a good place to just warehouse people. There certainly were many people who were psychotic and needed to be hospitalized, but there were a lot who probably didn't. But anyway, my father was asked to take over the ward that had the most disturbed patients. He said, well, I want to think about it. And he did think about it. And then he did something that it's hard to imagine today to think about this, but my father was an attendant. As I said earlier, that's kind of like being a guard. Well, the guy that ran the hospital was a psychiatrist. He was a physician, so physicians aren't usually used to having the attendants telling them what should be done. The things go the other way. Well, my father went back to the superintendent of the hospital and said he would take it if they would allow him to make some changes on that ward as to how the patients were dealt with. And because my father had so much empathy with people because of his experiences of being thrown into prison by the Nazis, he had a lot of empathy for people. So the superintendent said, well, what do you have in mind, Henry? My father said, we're going to do away with the strong room. The strong room was the padded cell. Those actually did exist in mental hospitals. Well, I'll think about that. He said, the patients are going to be issued utensils and they're going to eat with silverware and not with their hands anymore. And we'll count the stuff out and count it back in. We'll think about that. We're not going to be using a straitjacket anymore. And the superintendent ceded to my father's, lack of a better word, demands, and he took over that ward and made many changes. And this, as I said, this was before there were psychoactive drugs and much treatment. And, psychotic people were really sick and they were not treated well, but he treated them well. And my mother also worked at the hospital. And then she ended up working for a psychiatrist. And she translated papers for him that came to him in Italian and German and French because she spoke 5 languages. So they both ended up working in the mental hospital in Traverse City for the state of Michigan, which maybe in the late 40s and the 50s, it didn't look like the best career in the world, but when they became older and retired, it turned out to be a pretty good deal with the benefits that they'd accrued and the fact that they got Social Security and state pension and health care and so on. We grew up in an idyllic place. Traverse City was right out of those books that we had when we were in grade school. Dick and Jane lived around the corner, and everybody had a dog named Spot. And it was Elm Street and Maple Street, and nobody locked their doors, and it was a wonderful time. I could go anywhere I wanted, all around town at any time. And I knew from a very early age that I was a really lucky person to be living in Traverse City, Michigan, because it is an absolutely gorgeous place still today. There are many, many opportunities to do a lot of exciting things. The water, I've always been a water person. I can't remember not knowing how to swim. The Rotary clubs and the Kiwanis clubs gave us free swimming lessons in the summer and free ski lessons in the winter. It was a pretty idyllic place. So, I had a fairly normal, whatever that means, growing up. I wasn't a great student because I always thought I was smarter than the teachers and was one of those kind of underachiever kind of guys. But I was very fortunate in that my mother taught me to read very, very early. I've been a voracious reader all my life, which has been a great asset to me. So I spent a lot of my college time reading novels instead of the textbooks that I was supposed to study. Played football on the football team, but wasn't any good at it. Graduated from high school. Stayed in Traverse City for my first 2 years of college at Northwestern Michigan College, which was a junior college that was funded by the Tri-County area there. And it hadn't been in existence very long. I graduated from high school in 1961, and the college opened in 53 or 54. But I knew a lot of the faculty because a lot of the faculty had become friends with my mother and father. So I went 2 years there, and then it was time to move on. And again, I was a mediocre student. But looking back, even though I thought at the time I wasn't learning anything, I clearly did learn something. And so after 2 years there, I applied to both the University of Michigan and Michigan State, and the first acceptance I got was Michigan State, so here I came to Michigan State. And I hate to sit here naked to the world and admit it, but I hated it. I felt like I was serving a sentence, that I was supposed to go to college and get a college degree, so that's what I did. And the morning of my last exam, my senior year, I packed my car. I went to Berkeley Hall and took an exam. I got in that car and I drove straight north out of town on Abbott Road, and I thought if I never see this town again, it's going to be fine with me. And then here I am today. I ended up back here running a business that was very, very good to me. The city has been very good to me. The experience has been amazing. And aside from the obvious feeling good about starting a business, having it succeed, I didn't get rich, but I made a living. I'm comfortable today. But it was a different kind of place. Some of you who will see this may remember it was the political watering hole in this town for a number of years. And rubbing shoulders with all of the politicos and having that catbird seat is an experience that few people ever could have had. I knew most of the state Supreme Court on a first-name basis, and the governors were customers, and the representatives were customers, and the lobbyists were customers. And so many political deals went down in the dining room of my restaurant. And on many, many occasions, I stood there talking to somebody who was a public official thinking, why are you telling me this? Maybe I shouldn't know this. But it was a very interesting time. A lot of interesting people worked there and ate there. And as I said earlier, Lansing and East Lansing is a special place in a lot of ways. Well, three of these aspects that really make it special is the university, the state government, and General Motors. So you had a really solid base economically. And because of the university and because of the state government and because of the GM as well, a lot of very interesting, smart, powerful, famous people came through Lansing and East Lansing. And many of them were entertained in Beggar's Banquet for dinner. So I got to meet a lot of really interesting people. We worked really hard, and it worked out. As I said, the American dream has really worked for me and my family. I was so fortunate. So many people don't get to do what they want to do. I ended up doing what I wanted to do, and I got what I wanted. The restaurant that we created was the restaurant I wanted, with just great food and totally casual atmosphere, no pretensions. And somebody said, well, who's your demographic? I said, my demographic is anybody who wants to come here and have a good time. And I was advised in the very beginning, because I looked like I looked today then, except obviously younger and darker hair. I was advised right after I opened, because I'd taken over a place that was, for lack of a better word, a hippie hangout, the best steakhouse. Some of the White Hills crowd said to me, Bob, your food's really good, but you're never going to make it here because you aren't going to get all the people that can afford your food to come through here and walk past all those hippies at your bar. And they said, what you really need is a separate dining room entrance. And I thought, we've all had that experience where somebody comes up and says, well, I'm just trying to help you out here. And you know damn well they're not trying to help you out. So I said, well, our policy here is let them that don't want none have fond memories of not getting any. If those people don't want to come here, we're going to make it without them. And of course, everybody came. Everybody came here. And that was what was so much fun. Everybody. Heads of the departments, guys and gals who are 9 years into working on their dissertation, standing next to a drug dealer, standing next to the Speaker of the House, and the minority guy in there standing there talking to each other, doing that kind of log rolling that we learned about when we took civics class, like they don't teach anymore, and running a government like they used to, that they don't do anymore. But I watched that transition happen, my politics I wear on my sleeve, but I have friends on both sides of the aisle, and that was one of the things that restaurant showed me was, I had some customers I normally wouldn't have given the time of day to that I got to really like, and find out that, there's some people who don't think like I do who are actually pretty smart. So that was good for me. I've been married to the same person for 57 years? No. Well, I got married in 1967, so you can figure that out yourself. And it's been great. I could not have done what I did without her, and she was a big part of the restaurant, and obviously, of my life. When we did have free time, the two things that we loved to do the most were to ski and to sail. And for a number of years, we had a sailboat that we kept in Northport, Michigan, and sailed all over the Great Lakes.